My name is Victoria, I'm 38 years old, and last Christmas was the first time in my entire life that I didn't spend the holidays feeling like I wasn't good enough. But to understand why that matters, I need to take you back to where it all started, to a childhood where love always came with conditions and acceptance was something I had to earn but never quite could. I grew up in a suburb of Detroit, Michigan, in a modest two-story colonial house with faded blue siding and a front porch that my father never got around to fixing. The winters there were brutal, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there until April. Snow would pile up in dirty gray mountains along the driveway, and the wind off Lake Michigan would rattle our windows all night long. Inside, the house always smelled like my mother's pot roast and disappointment, though I didn't have words for that second smell until I was much older. My family was what people in the neighborhood called respectable. My father worked as a manager at an auto parts factory, coming home every evening with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion in his eyes. My mother was a homemaker who took immense pride in her perfectly decorated house, her involvement in the church auxiliary, and most importantly in my older brother Daniel. Daniel was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the son who made my parents' faces light up when he walked into a room. He was a star athlete in high school, got a football scholarship to Michigan State, married his high school sweetheart Emily right after graduation, and gave my parents 3 beautiful grandchildren before he turned 30. And then there was me, the daughter who was always just a little bit wrong, a little bit too much, a little bit not enough. I was too loud, too opinionated, too ambitious, too focused on things that didn't matter according to my mother's worldview. I wanted to go to college out of state, which was seen as abandoning the family. I wanted to study business and finance, which my mother said wasn't feminine. I didn't have a boyfriend in high school, which worried her. Then when I did date, I chose the wrong kind of men, the ones with ambition and drive who didn't want to settle down in suburban Detroit and work at the factory. The Christmas dinners of my childhood were elaborate affairs that my mother spent weeks planning. She'd pull out her fine china, the set she'd inherited from her mother, with the delicate pink roses and gold trim. The dining room table would be extended to its full length, covered with a white lace tablecloth that had to be ironed for hours. There would be a turkey, of course, golden and perfect, surrounded by all the traditional sides: mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, sweet potato pie, cranberry sauce, stuffing made from my grandmother's recipe. The house would be decorated within an inch of its life, every surface covered with snowman figurines, ceramic Santas, and enough tinsel to blind someone. But despite all that abundance, I always felt hungry at those dinners. Not for food, but for something I couldn't name. I'd sit at that table in my assigned seat at the far end, away from the center where my parents sat with Daniel and his family, and I'd watch them laugh and share stories and pass dishes back and forth, and I'd feel like I was watching through a window rather than actually being there. My accomplishments were never quite worth celebrating. When I graduated high school with honors, my mother's response was to ask why I wasn't valedictorian like Daniel had been, conveniently forgetting that Daniel had actually been salutatorian. When I got accepted to NYU's business school with a partial scholarship, she cried, but not from pride. She cried because I was leaving, because I was choosing my own path over the one she'd imagined for me. I left for New York City when I was 18, and it felt like I could finally breathe for the first time in my life. The city was everything Detroit wasn't: fast, ambitious, full of people who wanted more and weren't ashamed of it. I worked my way through college, taking internships at financial firms, sleeping 4 hours a night, living on coffee and determination. I graduated at the top of my class and got hired by a prestigious investment firm in Manhattan. I was 22 years old, making more money than my father had ever made, living in a tiny studio apartment in the East Village that cost more per month than my parents' mortgage, and I was happier than I'd ever been. But that happiness came with a price. The more successful I became, the more distant my family grew. My mother would call once a month, and the conversations always followed the same pattern. She'd ask about my job in a tone that suggested I was doing something vaguely shameful, like I was a stripper rather than a financial analyst. She'd tell me about Daniel's latest promotion, his kids' achievements, the new house he'd bought. She'd mention that Emily had made the most wonderful casserole for church potluck, implying that I, living my selfish single life in the city, would never be capable of such domestic perfection. And she'd always end the conversation by asking when I was going to settle down, find a nice man, and give her more grandchildren, as if my career and my life meant nothing without those things. I went home for Christmas every year out of obligation more than desire. I'd book a flight to Detroit, rent a car, and drive through the gray slush to my childhood home, where I'd sleep in my old bedroom that my mother had redecorated into a sewing room, as if erasing any evidence that I'd ever lived there. The Christmas dinners continued in their tradition, with me at the far end of the table, listening to everyone celebrate Daniel's life while mine was politely ignored or subtly criticized. When I was 28, I started my own investment firm. It was a terrifying leap, leaving the security of my corporate job to build something of my own. I worked 100-hour weeks, maxed out my credit cards, lived on ramen and ambition. There were months when I wasn't sure I'd make payroll, nights when I'd lie awake wondering if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. But slowly, painfully, the firm started to grow. I had a gift for identifying undervalued companies, for seeing potential where others saw risk. My client list expanded. My reputation grew. By the time I was 32, my firm was managing over $100 million in assets, and I was personally worth more than I'd ever imagined possible. I bought my first real apartment that year, a beautiful 2-bedroom in Tribeca with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River. I called my mother to tell her, excited to finally share good news that even she couldn't diminish. Her response was to ask how much I'd paid, and when I told her, there was a long silence. Then she said, "That's more than most people make in a lifetime, Victoria. I hope you're not becoming one of those greedy Wall Street types." I hung up feeling like I'd been slapped. The pattern continued for years. Every success I achieved was met with criticism disguised as concern. When I was featured in Forbes' 30 Under 30 list, my mother said it was nice but asked if all that publicity might make it harder for me to find a husband, since men were intimidated by successful women. When I expanded my firm and hired 15 new employees, she worried that I was working too hard and would ruin my health. When I bought a weekend house in the Hamptons, she said it seemed lonely to have such a big house with no family to fill it. The truth was, I had built a family. Not the traditional kind my mother valued, but a family nonetheless. I had my team at work, brilliant people who'd taken a chance on my vision and helped build something remarkable. I had friends in the city, other ambitious women who understood the sacrifices and the triumphs. I had mentors and protégés and a network of people who respected what I'd accomplished. But none of that counted in my mother's eyes, because I didn't have a husband and children. When I turned 35, I met James. He was a professor of architecture at Columbia, divorced with a teenage daughter, kind and brilliant and completely comfortable with my success. We fell in love slowly, carefully, both of us having been hurt before. He'd come to my Tribeca apartment after his evening classes, and we'd cook dinner together and talk for hours about everything and nothing. He loved that I was ambitious, that I had built something meaningful, that I wasn't content to just exist but wanted to make an impact. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone saw me completely and loved what they saw. I brought James home for Christmas that year, nervous but hopeful that maybe finally, I'd done something right in my mother's eyes. I'd found a good man, a professor, someone respectable and kind. Surely this would be enough. We drove from the airport through the familiar gray streets of Detroit, past the closed factories and struggling neighborhoods, and I found myself apologizing for things I'd never apologized for before. The modest size of my childhood home. The way my mother could be judgmental. The fact that Daniel would dominate every conversation. That Christmas dinner was one of the most uncomfortable evenings of my life. My mother was polite to James but cold, asking pointed questions about his divorce, his daughter, his salary as a professor. She made comments about how difficult it must be for him to date someone so focused on her career, how she hoped I was making time for the relationship despite my demanding job. Daniel made jokes about James being an academic, implying that real men worked with their hands or in business. My father barely spoke, just ate his turkey and avoided eye contact. James handled it all with grace, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. On the drive back to the airport, he asked me gently why I subjected myself to that every year. I didn't have a good answer. James and I got engaged 6 months later. It was perfect and private, just the two of us on a weekend trip to Paris, standing on the Pont d'Arts at sunset. I called my mother to tell her, expecting that finally, this would be the thing that made her proud. Instead, she asked why we were rushing into things, whether I was sure I wanted to take on a stepdaughter, whether James was financially stable enough to support me if my business failed. I realized then, sitting in our Paris hotel room with tears running down my face, that nothing I ever did would be enough for her. The problem wasn't my choices. The problem was that I wasn't Daniel and I never would be. The engagement ended 8 months later, not because we didn't love each other, but because the stress of planning a wedding brought all our differences into sharp focus. James wanted something simple and intimate. I wanted to prove something to my family, to have the big celebration that would finally make them see me as successful in all the ways that mattered. We started fighting about things that didn't matter, and eventually, we both realized we were trying to force something that wasn't quite right. We ended things amicably, sadly, and I threw myself back into work with a vengeance. That year when I was 37, my firm had its best year ever. We'd made some brilliant investments that paid off spectacularly, and my personal net worth crossed 8 figures. I decided to celebrate by buying my dream house, something I'd been looking at for months but hadn't quite had the courage to pull the trigger on. It was a modern mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, about an hour from the city, with 6 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a pool, a home theater, and a chef's kitchen that looked like something from a magazine. The architecture was stunning, all glass and clean lines and natural light. It sat on 3 acres of perfectly landscaped property, with old-growth trees and a garden that bloomed in every season. The price tag was $5 million and I paid cash. Moving into that house felt like a declaration of independence. Every room was exactly what I wanted, decorated with art I'd collected and furniture I'd chosen. The master bedroom had a fireplace and a balcony overlooking the property. The office had built-in bookshelves and space for all my awards and achievements. The kitchen had professional-grade appliances that I was slowly learning to use, taking cooking classes on weekends because I finally had the time and space to explore that interest. For the first time in my life, I had a home that felt like mine, not a space I was borrowing or a place I was trying to fit into. I called my mother to tell her about the house, and her response was predictable. She said it seemed excessive for one person, that I was being foolish with my money, that I should be saving for my future instead of buying mansions. She didn't ask to see pictures. She didn't congratulate me. She just criticized and worried and made me feel like a child who'd made a bad decision, despite the fact that I was a 37-year-old woman who'd built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing. That conversation planted a seed in my mind, one that grew throughout the fall as the holidays approached. Every year I went to Detroit for Christmas. Every year I sat at the end of that table and felt invisible. Every year I listened to my mother praise Daniel and subtly criticize me. Every year I left feeling smaller and sadder and wondering why I kept subjecting myself to it. And this year for the first time I had an alternative. I had a house big enough to host Christmas dinner myself. I had the resources to make it spectacular. And I had the growing realization that I didn't owe my family my presence if they couldn't give me their respect. In early November I called my mother and suggested that maybe this year I could host Christmas at my new house. I'd been practicing my cooking, I said. I had plenty of space. It would be nice for everyone to see my home, and it would save her the work of preparing the big dinner. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then my mother said, in that particular tone she used when she was about to say something cruel disguised as honesty, that she didn't think that was a good idea. Christmas was a family tradition, she said, and it should be in the family home. Besides, she added, she wasn't sure my house was appropriate for a family gathering, given that it was so modern and cold, not warm and traditional like a real home. I pushed back gently, saying that my home was warm and that I'd really like to host. My mother's voice got sharper. She said that Daniel and Emily and the kids were expecting Christmas at her house, that it was what they looked forward to all year, and that it would be selfish of me to disrupt that tradition just because I'd bought some fancy house and wanted to show off. The words hit me like a physical blow. After everything I'd accomplished, she still saw me as selfish, as someone showing off rather than someone who'd earned what she had. I took a breath and made one more attempt. I said that I'd really like to be part of the family celebration, and that hosting seemed like a nice way to contribute. And that's when my mother said the words that changed everything. She said, in a voice that was almost casual in its cruelty, that if I was going to have an attitude about it, maybe it would be better if I didn't come at all this year. That the table was already going to be crowded with Daniel's family, and that one less person wouldn't be a problem. That maybe I needed some time to think about what family really meant, since I'd spent so many years prioritizing my career over the people who actually mattered. I sat there in my beautiful home office, looking out at the fall leaves turning gold and red on my property, and felt something inside me break. Not break like shattering, but break like a chain snapping. She'd finally said out loud what I'd always known she felt, that I wasn't really wanted at that table. That my presence was tolerated but not desired. That I was the obligation, the difficult daughter, the one who didn't quite fit into the perfect family picture she'd created in her mind. I said very calmly, "Okay. I won't come this year then." My mother seemed surprised, like she'd expected me to beg or apologize or back down like I always had before. She started to backtrack, saying she didn't mean it quite like that of course I was welcome if I really wanted to come. But I cut her off. I said I understood perfectly, that she'd made herself clear, and that I hoped they had a lovely Christmas. Then I hung up. I sat in that office for a long time, watching the afternoon light fade and the shadows grow long across my lawn. I felt sad, but underneath the sadness was something else. Relief. Relief that I didn't have to pretend anymore. Relief that I didn't have to sit at that table and smile while being made to feel small. Relief that I could finally stop trying to earn love from people who were determined not to give it. Over the next few weeks, as Thanksgiving came and went, I started to think about what I actually wanted for Christmas. For the first time in my life, I had complete freedom to choose. I didn't have to go to Detroit. I didn't have to sit through an uncomfortable dinner. I could do anything I wanted. The possibilities felt overwhelming and exhilarating. I started making a list of people who'd been there for me over the years, people who'd celebrated my successes and supported me through failures, people who saw me for who I actually was and liked what they saw. My assistant Rachel, who'd been with me since the early days of the firm and had become one of my closest friends. My college roommate Jennifer, who lived in Boston now with her wife and 2 kids. My mentor Margaret, who'd taken a chance on me when I was just starting out and had guided my career ever since. James, my ex-fiancé, who I'd stayed friends with despite the breakup. His daughter Sophie, who I'd grown close to and still met for lunch once a month. A handful of colleagues who'd become genuine friends. People from my cooking class. My neighbors in Greenwich who'd welcomed me warmly to the community. I realized I could fill a Christmas table with people who actually wanted to be there, who valued me, who would celebrate with me rather than tolerate me. And once I had that realization, the plan came together quickly. I would host Christmas dinner at my house. Not for my family of origin, but for my chosen family. I would create the kind of celebration I'd always wanted. Warm, genuine, full of laughter and good food and people who actually enjoyed each other's company. I sent out invitations in early December, elegant cards with a simple message. "You're invited to Christmas dinner at my home. Please join me in celebrating the season with good food, good company, and gratitude for the people who make life meaningful." The responses came back quickly, all enthusiastic yes. People were touched to be included, excited to see my new house, happy to have somewhere to go for the holidays. I threw myself into planning with the same focus I brought to my business. I hired a chef to help me plan the menu and teach me how to execute it. I wanted to cook the meal myself, to create something with my own hands for people I cared about. We planned a menu that was both traditional and elevated. Herb-roasted turkey with a cognac gravy, truffle mashed potatoes, roasted Brussels sprouts with pancetta, butternut squash soup with sage, homemade rolls, and 3 different desserts. I ordered the finest ingredients, practiced techniques, timed everything down to the minute. I decorated my house for Christmas, but not like my mother's cluttered, overwhelming style. I hired a designer who created something elegant and warm. White lights wrapped around the stair railing, a massive fresh wreath on the front door, a 12-foot Christmas tree in the living room decorated in gold and silver, fresh garlands with real pine cones and berries, candles everywhere. The house smelled like pine and cinnamon and possibility. I bought gifts for everyone, thoughtful things that showed I knew them and valued them. A first edition book for Margaret, who collected them. Art supplies for Sophie, who was studying design. A spa weekend for Rachel, who worked too hard. I wrapped everything myself, sitting on my living room floor with rolls of beautiful paper and ribbon, feeling more excited about Christmas than I had in decades. My mother called twice in December. The first time she asked if I'd changed my mind about coming to Detroit, her tone suggesting she expected me to apologize and beg to be included. I said no, I had other plans and I hoped they had a wonderful celebration. He seemed shocked. The second time, a week before Christmas, she called to tell me that she'd mentioned to some relatives that I wasn't coming, and they'd asked why, and it had been embarrassing for her to explain. She said I was being selfish and childish, that I was hurting the family with my attitude, that I needed to grow up and stop holding grudges. I listened to her entire speech and then I said something I'd never said before. "Mom, I love you, but I don't like the way you treat me. I've spent my entire life trying to earn your approval and never succeeding. This year I'm choosing to spend Christmas with people who actually appreciate me. I hope you can understand that, but if you can't, that's okay too. Merry Christmas. Then I hung up. My hands were shaking, but I felt powerful. I'd finally said what needed to be said, set the boundary that needed to be set. Whatever happened next, I told my truth. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow, the kind of picture-perfect white Christmas that you see in movies. My house looked like something from a fairy tale, all lit up against the snowy landscape. I spent the day cooking, following my carefully planned timeline, and the house filled with the most incredible smells. Rachel came early to help, and we worked together in the kitchen, drinking champagne and laughing and listening to Christmas music. The guests started arriving at 5, stomping snow off their boots in my foyer, exclaiming over how beautiful everything looked. I'd set the dining room table with elegant china and crystal, with a centerpiece of white roses and pine branches, with place cards for everyone. As people gathered in the living room with cocktails, I looked around at the scene and felt my eyes well up with tears. This was what Christmas was supposed to feel like. Warm, joyful, full of people who genuinely wanted to be together. We sat down to dinner at 7 and it was perfect. The food was delicious, the conversation flowed easily, people laughed and told stories and complimented everything. Margaret made a toast, thanking me for opening my home and my heart, saying that this was what the holidays were really about. Choosing to celebrate with people who lift you up. Everyone raised their glasses and I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the wine. Halfway through dinner my phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. Mom is upset that you're not here. He's barely eating. This is really selfish of you, Vic. It's Christmas. I looked at that message for a long moment, feeling the old guilt try to rise up. But then I looked around my table at these people who were here because they wanted to be, who valued me, who were having a genuinely wonderful time. I put my phone away without responding. After dinner we moved to the living room for dessert and gifts. I'd set up a fire in the fireplace and we sat around it like kids, passing presents and exclaiming over thoughtful surprises. Sophie gave me a drawing she'd made of my house, and it was so beautiful I immediately knew where I'd frame it. Jennifer's kids performed a little song they'd learned. James brought a bottle of wine from the year we'd met, saying that even though things hadn't worked out romantically, he was grateful I was still in his life. It was intimate and real and everything my family Christmases had never been. Around 11, as people were starting to leave, bundling up against the cold and hugging me goodbye and thanking me for the most wonderful Christmas, my phone rang. It was my mother. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She was crying, which was rare for her. She said that Christmas hadn't been the same without me, that the table had felt empty, that she'd realized maybe she'd been too harsh. She asked what I'd done for the day, her tone suggesting she assumed I'd spent it alone, feeling sorry for myself. I looked around at my beautiful house, at the remnants of the perfect dinner, at Rachel who was helping me clean up and making me laugh. I said, I hosted Christmas dinner at my house, Mom. I cooked for 12 people and it was the best Christmas I've ever had. There was a long silence. Then she asked in a small voice who I'd invited. I listed the names, none of which were family. Another silence. Then she said, You chose strangers over your own family? And I said very gently but very firmly, I chose people who treat me with respect and kindness. That's not the same thing as choosing strangers over family. That's choosing family over people who happen to be related to me. She started to argue, to tell me I was being dramatic, that she'd always loved me and supported me. And for the first time I didn't let her rewrite history. I said, Mom, you told me not to come. You said the table was crowded and one less person wouldn't matter. You've spent my entire adult life criticizing my choices and comparing me unfavorably to Daniel. I'm not angry about it anymore, but I'm also not going to keep pretending it didn't happen. I love you, but I don't need your approval anymore. I've built a good life and I'm proud of it, whether you are or not. I could hear her crying harder now, and part of me felt guilty, but a bigger part of me felt free. I'd finally said everything I'd been holding in for decades. Whatever happened next, I told my truth. She said she needed to go, that we'd talk about this later, and hung up. I stood there in my kitchen, phone in hand, and Rachel came over and hugged me. You okay? She asked. I nodded. Yeah. I really am. The weeks after Christmas were strange. My mother didn't call, which was unusual. Daniel sent me a few angry texts, saying I'd ruined Christmas and hurt Mom's feelings and needed to apologize. I didn't respond. Some extended family members reached out, having heard some version of the story, and their reactions were mixed. Some thought I'd been cruel. Others, surprisingly, said they understood, that they'd noticed how my mother treated me differently than Daniel and had always thought it was unfair. In mid-January my father called. He never called, so I knew it was serious. He said that my mother had been depressed since Christmas, that she'd been doing a lot of thinking, that maybe some things needed to change. He said in his quiet way, that he was proud of what I'd accomplished, that he'd always been proud but hadn't known how to say it. He said he hoped I'd give them another chance someday, but that he understood if I needed time. It was the most honest conversation I'd ever had with him, and I cried after we hung up. In February my mother sent me a letter. An actual handwritten letter, which was so unlike her that I was nervous to open it. In it she apologized. Not a perfect apology, not one that took full responsibility, but an attempt. She said she'd been thinking about how she'd treated me over the years, and that maybe she'd been harder on me than she'd realized. She said she'd always been scared that I'd get hurt, that the world would chew me up and spit me out, and that maybe her fear had come out as criticism. She said she was proud of me even if she'd never said it properly. She said she hoped we could rebuild our relationship, but that she understood it would take time and that she'd have to earn back my trust. I read that letter 3 times, sitting in my office overlooking my snow-covered property. It wasn't everything I'd wanted to hear, but it was a start. I wrote back, thanking her for the apology and saying that I was open to working on our relationship, but that things would have to be different going forward. That I needed to be treated with the same respect she gave Daniel. That my choices in my life needed to be valued, not just tolerated. That I wouldn't accept criticism disguised as concern anymore. I mailed the letter and waited. It's been almost a year since that Christmas now. My relationship with my mother is still complicated, still a work in progress. We talk on the phone every few weeks and the conversations are careful, both of us trying to find a new way of relating to each other. She's made efforts. She asked to see pictures of my house and actually complimented them. She mentioned my firm's success to her friends, which I heard about through the family grapevine. She sent me a birthday card that said she was proud of me, which made me cry. It's not perfect and maybe it never will be, but it's better. Daniel and I barely speak, which is sad but also a relief. I realized that we'd never really had a relationship beyond being siblings, that we'd never chosen each other as people we'd want in our lives. Maybe someday that will change, but for now I'm okay with the distance. The people who came to my Christmas dinner last year have become even more important to me. We get together regularly now, celebrating birthdays and promotions and random Tuesdays when someone needs company. They've become my real family, the people I call when something good happens or when I need support. Rachel is now my business partner and we're expanding the firm. Sophie is interning with us this summer. Margaret and I have lunch once a month and she's become the mother figure I always needed. I'm hosting Christmas again this year and the guest list has grown. People are already asking if they can bring friends, if they can contribute dishes, if we can make it an annual tradition. My house, which I bought as a symbol of my success, has become something even more valuable. A gathering place for people who've chosen each other, a home filled with genuine love and laughter. Sometimes I think about that moment last Christmas when my mother told me not to come, when she said one less person at the table wouldn't matter. At the time it felt like the cruelest thing she'd ever said to me. But now I see it as a gift, because it forced me to finally stop waiting for her approval and start building the life in the family I actually wanted. It pushed me to create something better than I'd ever had, to fill my table with people who actually wanted me there. I'm 38 years old, I live in a $5 million mansion that I bought with money I earned, and last Christmas was the first time I didn't spend the holidays feeling like I wasn't good enough. Because I finally realized that I am good enough, that I've always been good enough, and that anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve a seat at my table. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever felt like you weren't enough for your family, like your accomplishments didn't matter, like you were always sitting at the end of the table looking in, I want you to know that you're not alone. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves is choose our own family, set our own table and invite people who actually see us. If this resonated with you, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end," so I know there are others out there who understand. And if you found something valuable in my story, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe, because there are more stories to tell, more truths to share, and I'd love to have you here for them. There's another story waiting for you, one that might speak to your heart just like this one did. Thank you for being here.